we've got the honor to have with us Ozoz. And as I was mentioning, I usually put some words introducing our guest speaker, but this time I would like you, as our guest, to tell us your story because we love stories, and yours is absolutely beautiful. Your story with the food, the way you look at gastronomy, again, as we were mentioning, beyond fine dining. So, Mike is yours. Welcome. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you again, Adela Lewis, for having me on. It's my pleasure to be here. And I'd like to start by sharing a land acknowledgement. I'm based in Mississauga, Ontario, Canada. So I'm going to do two things. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see the land acknowledgement as well. Make sure I share sound just in case. So share my screen. And I will put the land acknowledgement on. Okay, just going to move one thing out of the way. So before I, go deep into this talk that explores my journey with gastronomy and what I think of as moving from my initial career as a geologist to one as, one who works with food in a variety of ways now. So, I'm joining you today from the treaty lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit Nation, First Nation, in what is known as Ontario, Canada. And it has been home to the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Wyandot nations historically, in the present, and will continue to be in the future. I acknowledge also those who came to these lands involuntarily, particularly as a result of transatlantic enslavement of Africans, and I pay tribute to all the ancestors. I think that land is such an important part of the work and lives that we live. There's nothing that we do that is separate from land. And moving to Canada from Nigeria kind of introduced me to land acknowledgements. There weren't things that I was familiar with prior to moving to North America 5 years ago. And I think that for me, they're really, really important in kind of setting the stage for that. So thank you for indulging me. Um, I'll share three primary things over the course of the next half hour. And I'll introduce myself and tell you a little bit about my journey. I'll tell you three things that I believe, three of many, that shape the work that I do with food. And then I'll share a little bit about projects and things that I'm working on. And, interesting things I'd hope to say. So, when I think about who I am, I consider myself a daughter, mother, sister, friend, colleague, in a variety of ways. I always share with people that I work with food. And I say that I work with food because my interests in food are vast. I eat with joy most days of the week, two or three times. I explore food through a variety of lenses. I read, I research, I cook, I write, I do field work in ways that I think of as extending from the grocery store to markets to farms and even bus stops, right? Anywhere there's someone else, there's something else that contributes to the food system, I think of them as being essential in this web and ecosystem of gastronomy. And my ultimate goal, which wasn't there from the start of my journey with food, but my ultimate goal is to use food as a way to understand history, culture, to help people get a sense of their identities, whether those are geographic identities or identities of commonality and similarity. And also, I think of identity as being connected to place, right? And time periods. Um, my work in this space began primarily with Nigerian and West African cuisine and has broadened since then. It's important for me as part of my process to learn. So I'm first a learner, and I love the process and the joy of learning. Part of my work, I think, is to unearth little known stories, forgotten things, to explore future possibilities of what food is. Documentation is a huge part of that. And I do that in a variety of different ways. So, one of those is my blog, which I think of as my foundational food space. I started writing that blog in 2009 when I lived in the Netherlands and when I discovered food as what I think of as more than eating. In kind of 2020, I moved to creating like a research space that explored less personal and more broader themes. And that you'll find on my website called Feast Afrique. So you'll find short films I've made, you find audio work, you find ongoing collections of explorations, and I'll talk a little bit more about them. And this year, I've also started really writing a newsletter that I first started 2 years ago. And and then I have future projects. And for me, all of this work is me as a piece of the puzzle of community, like community around food, around gastronomy, around things like that. All of my work, most of my work is community centered. And in kind of thinking about the tools that I employ in kind of exploring these, I look at oral history, cookbooks, food books, literature, memoir, travel books, and so much more. And the title of my talk says From Geology to Gastronomy. Why? So, in my previous life, not previous life, in this life, but earlier on in my career, I studied as a geologist and worked as a geologist for about 20 years and ended up not really enjoying it. But I learned many things in that process that serve as useful tools, techniques, structures, and they inform the way that I engage with food, I engage with gastronomy, and I engage with community around these things. One of them, for instance, is the power of observation. And I'm Nigerian. In Nigeria, a country of over 200 million people and hundreds of languages, names of spices and fruits can change, just across a few kilometers or yeah, kilometers. And so I've had to rely on my observation skills, my sensory exploration skills, to find out, for instance, the scientific or botanical names for things. In this image, you see a spiky core of a fruit that I now know as the June plum. But when I first encountered it, I didn't know what it was. But using basic observation skills like, when I wanted to find out the name for this tool, I just went online and I searched fruit with spiky core. And it popped up the name, and then I could verify. So for me, there's so many aspects of my career as a geologist that shape the work that I do today. I bring memory into play. I look at moving from what I know about a thing to approaching new subject areas. I experiment a lot, which is not surprising considering that I have a scientific background. But I'm also the sort of person who follows a principle of Kaizen, which is a Japanese philosophy of continuous and never-ending philosophy improvement. I also do a lot of historical work and timeline building because I think that puts into things into a lot of context. In all of these things that I do, again, the goal is always sharing. And my most recent big project that I'd say beyond like my websites and things like that is my debut cookbook. It came out in March of 2025, and it's really the first comprehensive look at classic Nigerian home cooking, covering all six regions of the country. So, again, when I think about how I work and the things that I do, kind of putting all of the things that I know to date into a format like a book, distinct from my website and distinct from like digital platforms, is one way of kind of engaging a broader set of people and groups of people into this space. So how did I get to food? It would surprise you to know that I actually did not enjoy eating until I was 9 years old. And this caused my parents a lot of grief because I was in and out of hospital. And I mean, look at me now, 41 years on, and like my whole life is focused on food. I think there's certain threads that exist in my journey that stand out for me. So when I think about my journey from geology to gastronomy, I think about it happening long before I knew those two words. It has taken me across different geographies. The first time I really had food that I enjoyed or that I recognized was when I was 9. I was on holiday from Nigeria with my dad and my older sister in Edinburgh, and two things stood out for me: the taste of a green apple and a hamburger from a fast food chain called Wimpy. And a common thread in all of the kind of defining moments of my journey have been place. And those places have been places away from home. I think they've presented me with opportunities to encounter, engage with new aspects of food, community, and things that may not have been obvious to me at home. So Edinburgh was kind of like the first place where I considered food as something enjoyable. Then I continued to live in Nigeria. I went to university in Nigeria. I studied urban and regional planning for 3 years. I didn't complete that degree for a variety of reasons. But in that space, I could see how cities were laid out and cities were designed to either encourage community or with structures that prevented that sort of community from building. So I'm thinking of spaces like parks and gardens, spaces that welcome and created opportunities for people to kind of network and meet each other and learn from each other. In the late 90s, I moved to Liverpool to go to university. I started from scratch and studied geology. And my first year was okay, but I did not really enjoy my second year. At this time, I was really homesick. I was trying to get used to cold winters, and I found that food, for the first time that I recognized, provided me with comfort. I could also appreciate, I lived in a huge house with like 16 roommates, 16 housemates. It was like 4 floors. It was a really huge house, but everyone came from like a different part of the world. And we found that in our common kitchen, we could learn a little bit about each other. We could learn from what people were cooking. We could learn from what people were making. And the kitchen it served as a site for building relationships and learning to grow in a cultural sense. And so I think that when I think of Liverpool and that process of studying geology, a perspective of food as comfort was revealed to me in a way that I didn't know previously. But the pivot around things for me would be when I moved to the Netherlands in 2007. At that time, my partner and I had three young children, 4, 2, and 0, and my life was very, very different from what it had been in Nigeria, where my family was close by, I had help. My relationship with food changed, and it changed for a number of reasons. The first thing was I was exposed to so many new ingredients, and I knew that my children were young, so I really wanted to document that. And so I started writing my blog. The second thing that really changed for me and has kind of moved my life in the direction of food history and research was encountering a Brazilian colleague, his name is Santiago, who one day at dinner, one night at dinner, we were all, we worked in our company's headquarters and we were all kind of like from different parts of the world. And so at dinner, you'd hear all sorts of discussions about food from all over the world. And Santiago was sharing with me a dish that he made and was very popular in his home country of Brazil. And without saying what that dish was, I recognized it, which I think blew my mind. But it also confused me because I'm like, he's talking about this dish, I recognize it, but how did it get to Brazil? And I think there was a whole part of history that I had taken as just films. So I'd watched films and you may be familiar with them, but films like Amistad and Roots and films that talked about transatlantic enslavement. I didn't really my discussion with Santiago kind of opened up my eyes to see how these were real stories. And in understanding kind of how Nigeria and Brazil were connected through this fritter, in Brazil it's called acarajé, and in Nigeria it's called akara, it kind of broadened my mind about not just community in terms of proximal people to you, but in these foodways connections that extended beyond geographies and beyond boundaries. And that really awakened my interest in both global foodways connections as well as food history. I then moved back to Nigeria where I started focusing primarily on documenting Nigerian cuisine. I lived in Nigeria for a few years and then I moved to Canada in January of 2020. And today, the work that I do is as a professor of food and tourism studies at a college. And I continue to work with food and, explore a number of things. And so this is a little bit about what Santiago shared with me, which surprised me. And it is the connection that I now think of as coast to coast, right? What are the similarities in cultures and cuisines? And we see them on a variety of levels. On one level here, for instance, we're looking at a kind of city to city connection between Lagos in Nigeria and Bahia, a region in Salvador in the northeast of Brazil. We're seeing gendered aspects of creating similar fritters made of beans consumed in similar ways. And I'll share shortly, not only do Nigeria and Brazil share that connection, but other countries across the Black Atlantic have that. So three things that I'd like
Yeah,
to,
one question. Sorry, I don't know if it's only my side, but you are keeping like a blank space in the screen. I don't know if maybe you are having like in the presentation. Yeah, exactly.
is this
So
good?
that's much better, much better. Yeah, I think
Okay,
that's perfect. Thank you. Sorry
okay.
about that.
No
Mm.
worries. Thanks for telling me. So, three beliefs in general that I'm going to share with you um, as we move on. So, one of them is that I'm fascinated by all the ways we're similar in spite of our differences. And if you look at the image on top, you'll see four different pans, and they come from three different countries, three of hundreds of countries that have these pans with divots. So you'll find in the top right, a Poffertjes pan from the Netherlands. Top left, you have the Abelskiver pan from Denmark. And the bottom two clay and aluminium versions are masa pans from Nigeria. And they all are used to fry some kind of fritter. The second belief I'm going to share is that food is more than eating, and that when things show up on our plate, they tell us a lot about history, culture, economics, trade, agriculture, like so many things. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see a fried pancake of sorts. And this is a combination of eggs and instant noodles. In Nigeria, it's very popular. In Lagos, is street food. And two things stand out for me: eggs and instant noodles. And in Nigeria, the history of eggs are, is a very specific history. That is, eggs didn't become really popular till like the Great Depression, 1930s. And there's a whole story behind that. But that's not something that would instantly jump out at you when looking at a plate of food in front of you. Instant noodles are also a recent import into Nigeria from Indonesia and are so popular now that there are discussions around nutrition and other things. And then finally, the last thing is this concept of geology in geology called uniformitarianism. It's a theory that says that the present is the key to the past. And for me, the inverse or the converse or some version of that is also true, in that the past is key to the present and the present is key to the future. And I can think of all of these on a continuum and how they shape the things that we do and the things that we learn. And so when I think about community, and through the work that I do, when I look at Nigerian cuisine, I often seek to understand differences in similarly composed regional dishes and drinks. And depending on the geography and thus the climate and agriculture, you'll find like a particular soup in Nigeria, like egusi soup, made with melon seeds. But across the country, there'll be different methods of making it. The greens used will be different, and just a whole number of things, but you'll be able to recognize the similar threads. You'll also see things like that in across the Black Atlantic. So going back to this case of the fritter, akara, that's the one that's similar to Nigerian akara, you'll see that it exists across the country, everywhere across the world, particularly a region where transatlantic enslavement impacted. And you can recognize these fritters by the similarity in name. So akras, akaraje, akra, akara, akala, kalas. You can also recognize that they're all fried or fritters, but that the geographic region and the staple crops or staple ingredients there shape the resulting fritter. And one of my long-term projects is building a connected atlas of foodways where I map these connections and provide additional research information for people who are interested. And so that looked at the Black Atlantic, and this is more of a global approach. In this case, I was mapping the use of culinary ashes across the world. And again, I feel like exploring that connectedness is key for me in understanding how I'm similar to other people, but also helping me find points of connection. When I think of this second belief I have is that food is more than eating. One, in that it tells us so much more, but the second thing is that food has various functions, and that in a basic sense, you can think of it as the physical function of eating and filling us up, but there's also the element of food as nourishing our bodies and souls. And so when we gather, in our diverse communities, we have to consider that food plays these multiple roles that support and strengthen us. And the final belief I have is on this theory of uniformitarianism, and it's that we can learn so much from the past and present, and part of that work needs to revolve around documentation. One of my beliefs is in making information accessible as a result. And on my Feast of Freak website, you'll find a digital library of over 250 resources that I've put together to support knowledge of West African and diasporic culinary connections and cuisines. And the information and the books and resources range from the 1800s to date. So you can check that out as well. And that was really a glimpse into kind of like pillars of beliefs that guide the work that I do and that support me as one piece of a puzzle in creating community. When I think about food and gastronomy, I think about all hands on deck, everyone working together, doing what they can, bringing their own unique skills to support, right? We can't all be the same. So you'll have the photographer, you'll have the videographer, you'll have people who are eating, you'll have the writers, you'll have documenters and researchers. And it's that sense of each person bringing a piece that makes the whole what it is. And so, what are some things that I'm working on next? I'm continuing to build my Atlas project, working on creating databases of culinary connections, and hoping to launch it hopefully in the next year or so. I'm also doing kind of detailed explorations of things like jollof rice, which is a dish that connects and unifies West Africans. So I'm doing that exploration by looking at cookbooks from 1900s to date. And then I'm also building kind of like standard material that codifies the knowledge. So looking at things like developing a flavor wheel that allows people understand the structure of cultures and cuisines, building on projects that I've created, like a seasonal produce calendar. And that's pretty much it. So I will stop there and I'll say thank you for listening. And yeah.
Thank you for sharing. I'm absolutely sure we've got lots of questions. There was one comment, love the illustrated food maps of relationships and diversity. And I also loved, the way you did that land acknowledgement. That was absolutely moving, to pay tribute to ancestors. Sometimes we forget the main aspects of us. So thank you very much indeed. And I'm sure there are many, many, many questions. Please just go ahead if you have any question. I'd like to let me start by saying something. You write Chop Chop, beyond sharing recipes, what deeper story or responsibility did you feel called to tell through Chop Chop? How did Chop Chop transform you? In what way?
I felt it was really important for me to create a reference book for Nigerians, especially at home, abroad, and for the rest of the world, because there aren't that many resources that give insight into Nigerian cuisine and culture. And I wanted to make sure that in making Chop Chop, it was very visual. And so you'll find, if you get a chance to have a look, or if it's in your library or you buy a copy, you'll find a great deal of illustrations. You'll find chapter photographic spreads that do like collection of ingredients to really show people what Nigerian cuisine and culture is like. I think it's also important through Chop Chop to make sure, like in the pages, I did my best to establish connections, to show people ways that were similar that might not be easily recognizable. And so, for instance, there's a recipe where I talk about cooking a particular soup in Nigeria with a clay pot. And I reference a Korean version of that clay pot used in a similar manner. And so for me, it's always about, I think of my work as bridging knowledge gaps, bridging research gaps, bridging all of those things.
Great, Jean. I think it's a very, very, very good word. Question.
And
Luis,
okay, and
go
I'm gonna
ahead. We do have a question, Luis.
Yeah, well, but if you wanna have the question from Ryan, but well, I'm gonna jump on this. So I am sharing here a project that we had done for the Venice Biennale some years ago, where Gabby, is a pity that Gabby is not here, but we have other team members that they were part of that. So what we sent to the Venice Biennale was what we call in between. That it was like the idea of uh, Gabi went to three different informal settlements in different parts of the world, in Latin America, in Nigeria, actually, so Guadalajara, Mexico, Nigeria, Port Harcourt, and in Cairo. And then she was following the person that was kind of in charge of cooking in a family or in the community. What happened was like she found like three leaders of communities. One was in Guadalajara, Mexico. The other was Mama G in Nigeria, and a person in Cairo as well. So the most interesting thing that is that she was making the same correlation. She was making between different food that was very similar in these three different places, and the price and mobility. I mean, she was trying. I mean, we are city science, so she was looking also in mobility elements. So for me, it was fascinating how a lot of the elements and the dishes, but also the utensils around food, they were very similar. So I am very impressed. The other thing that I am impressed is that she is now making an atlas. So
Oh,
so yeah, so it's very cool because she's kind of it's more about thinking about the future of cities through imagination, but at the end of the day, it's like trying to have the perspective of also of the local people. How do they see the future and use imagination to explore that? So I see a lot of connections between you and Gabby. So I think one important we should put you in touch with her. But my question is, here we are at the MIT Media Lab. We are kind of antidisciplinary or transdisciplinary. That means that we are coming from different backgrounds. I am an architect and I am working in with data, for instance, or smart cities. So that's kind of something. So you are coming from a different field, no? Geology. So how that has changed your? I mean, like, can I don't know if you are bringing some of that. You were talking about the past, no? So I don't know if there is that connection, because I think for people listening to you, it could be very useful to understand how much of the past and the present is putting into this book and other projects. I mean,
so thank you for sharing that and kind of how one Gabby's work. Please put us in touch. I'd appreciate that, and for sharing the link. Thank you. And the other thing is about how my work as a geologist shapes my work with food. It informs it greatly. It informs my approach to developing recipes, in the structure in which I develop recipes, but primarily it enables me observation, my strength of observation as a geologist, which was one that we would use in the field. So when you went on a field trip, you couldn't bring the mountains back with you. So you had to use your sensory skills to describe the rock. So you'd look at basic characteristics like what are you seeing? What's the color? What are textures and things like that? How does it smell? How does it taste? Occasionally would taste the rock. How does it feel? And all of those elements I bring to bear when I am working with food, whether it's a basic description of something that I want to make familiar or something new that I encounter that I don't have a lot of context for. So I bring that observation and sensory skill approach. I bring the approach of dating, so using historical methods and means to understand the sequence of events. So carbon dating in the science world helps us estimate when, an event happened or when something was created. I use cookbooks and dictionaries primarily to help me date culinary events. In the Jollof project, and Ryan, I'm going to answer your question alongside. In the case of jollof rice, it's a dish that has its origins, at least its name, comes from a 15th century region and state in Senegal and Gambia, so typically called Senegambia. And that dish exists across West Africa. And one of the primary distinctions of the Senegambian version of jollof rice is that it has vegetables. And in Senegal today, the dish still has vegetables. However, in Nigeria, that dish no longer has vegetables. And there's a question for me about how the current and contemporary version of jollof rice today is very different from the origin, right? Because usually when you're tracing similarities, there's some shared elements that allow you to say, this is one family, this is the thread, or this is kind of like the sequence. It started here. And so in using the cookbooks, and I'm going to come back to the significance of jollof rice, in using the cookbooks, I'm able to see that in the early versions, in the 1910 versions, up until we got to around the 1950s, when Nigeria became independent, versions had greens and they had vegetables. Right? So many of the early versions were actually very similar to the Senegambian version. So what happened in the 60s? Nigeria became independent. Oil and gas was discovered in like the 50s and 60s. It was a richer country. And there are trends that we see across the world where with affluence and increased economic status, that food processing tends to increase. And that is, people tend to eat less processed things, they eat more processed things. There's some status thing connected to prosperity that people that kind of changes consumption patterns. And so I basically use all of these different elements to try to build some reasonable data-backed explanations for why things might be the way they are. The one thing I learned from writing a cookbook, though, is that absolutes are not the way to go. I think writing Chop Chop humbled me in that regard, because before Chop Chop, I was like, I'm Nigerian, I'm an expert, I know Nigerian culture and cuisine. And within a few months of writing, I got cold feet because I realized that I couldn't say hand on chest that this is the exact way. And I think that was also a gift because I could make generalizations without losing the essence. So Ryan says, could you expand on the purpose of jollof rice? So jollof rice is this red rice seasoned dish that is associated with Nigerian celebrations. It is a unique dish and marker across West Africa, so it connects us. It is incredibly delicious. And so it has cultural significance. It's also one of those dishes that is, because it has appeared on, because it's been there from time, it's one of those dishes that often is on menus. So if you look at, I've recently started a I recently started a project of exploring historic menus in Nigerian cuisine. And from in these, I'm looking at airline menus, I'm looking at menus hosting dignitaries, I'm looking at menus from restaurants and a number and cookbooks. Jollof rice tends to feature because it has, there are just certain characteristics of food that make them popular. So jollof rice is one of those things. It connects us, it's present at all events, but in a way, it's also kind of like paella in that sense. It has that same quality of being able to incorporate vegetables. It also has the sensory characteristics. You have rice, you have the sokarat, and you have that. In Nigeria, we call it bottom pot, which again is a scientific thing of the Maillard reaction. So yeah, that's jollof rice, and it's a great thing. And I think that it's an easy dish to study to provide a lens into how the cuisine has changed and see if we can tie those to social events, economic events, and other things that would have happened across the timeline. History
Thank you
taught through
so
food
much.
culture is essential. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have more questions? I'm sure we do.
Hi, so I have a question. So you that have lived in like different countries in Canada, UK, Netherlands, Nigeria, how would you describe the food, like the importance of food in like the different countries? Like, what's the role of the food in each country?
So there are multiple roles of food. I think beyond the basic role of food as physical nourishment, in Canada, for instance, I live not too far from Toronto, and there are so many supper clubs, dining experiences, many things that are seeking to counter the epidemic of loneliness that we see. So in the case of Canada, I can say for sure, like in Ontario, at least where I live, I can say that food is there as an intervention. It's there as a means to build community. And you see that in pop-ups, you see that in dining experiences, you see it with people sharing a lot online and in kind of inviting people to spaces where they feel less alone. In Nigeria, historically, food was both about survival, but also about enjoyment. But it was in a different way. Nigerians would eat food at home in Nigeria, and when they were abroad, they would seek Nigerian food as well. Right? And again, I'm not saying all Nigerians, I'm saying that there's a major thing about Nigerians both at home and abroad looking for Nigerian food. In the last 20 years, that's also changing, not so much for wanting to build community, but Nigerians are also, there's a sense of, you have a recent spate of Nigerians, particularly who work with food, either living across dual places, and so returning back to Nigeria with new ideas, new formats, new ways of doing things, and new experiences. And there's that curiosity. So you're seeing a lot of dining experiences built around novelty, right? Oh, there's still a community element, but maybe there's some loneliness, but it isn't on the levels, I'd say without having exact numbers, just gut feeling, isn't on the level as in Canada. I think when I lived in the Netherlands, I had to write my blog because generally many of the Dutch people that I encountered ate to meet their nutritional needs and not as an intense form of enjoyment. And so, yeah, those are kind of like the different experiences that I've had, and different things I can say about the different places. But I've also lived in them at different times of my life on my journey as well, right? So my perspective is, I don't know, I mean, it's unique in that sense.
Thank you. We do have another question. When original ingredients or techniques disappear, do you see modern adaptations of traditional recipes as preservation or as entirely new creations?
When I think of creations, I think that it exists on a spectrum. And I say this because there are many elements of creating and naming a dish, of creating a dish. There's the name, right? So does the name preserve the historical, or does it rework and create something else that's contemporary? There's the method, there are the ingredients. So it depends on the unique combination, but I don't know. It depends. I'm someone who works across both preserving the cultural and the traditional, but also exploring contemporary approaches. I think it's important, particularly in cuisines that aren't rich in written text, to include information that bridges, right? So for me, those bridges are always important. If you're going to rename something, respect the origins. And I try to do that as much in the work that I do. Whether it's a simple thing like if I'm using Vietnamese jasmine rice, for instance, versus the more common to me Thai jasmine rice, I'll state that. And I'll state Indian basmati, and I'll try to, make sure that that origin, that provenance is respected and honored in the naming. So it could be both. I think there's space for both. I hope that
Respect.
answers Sumit.
Yeah, respect the origins. That is a fantastic and beautiful answer. I don't know if you could take us on a sensory journey through Nigeria.
Oh, there's a
Which
question from
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah. Could I make you a question, or does anybody else have a question?
I have a quick
Yeah.
question.
Oh, go ahead, please, please.
Have you found some cultures are more susceptible or vulnerable to kind of like the pressures of external forces? Like, for example, Lebanese cuisine is very, very strong. And even if you put a wimpy in the middle of Beirut, it will not take traction. Whereas in other zones, maybe not so much, that there is this kind of like magnetism. Have you been mapping those kinds of influxes and outputs of different zones?
I think there are a number of things, and what you say about Lebanese culture, I can say is true because the second foreign cuisine that I grew up with in Nigeria was Lebanese, the first Chinese. And I
Right.
say that I've had the best Chinese food ever in Nigeria.
Yeah.
Nothing can compare. But I think that there's something to be said for local community and food values. That is, the value that we place on the food. So in Nigeria, and for many Nigerians, Nigerian food will always Nigerian food will always be at the fore. You'll have a lot of influences, but Nigerian food businesses never go out of fashion for maybe, I feel like there are many elements that shape that. There's the media. And the role of media, marketing, and advertising can really shift people's perceptions of their culture. So there's something around, I think, media visibility. There's also something about how the traditional foods show up in the daily lives, but also in the lives in at occasions and at events. I can't categorically say that I haven't mapped countries that have these more traditional, oh, this strength and resistance against foreign or external factors. But I think that there are many things the many ties that create that foundation, right? That the the predominant culture and the value of the food from the people themselves within that culture is super important in shaping how, like, how it can be impacted or not. But I haven't done any kind of like that sort of
Yeah, I don't
mapping.
know. I wonder because I mean, I feel like, Tuscany is an incredibly influenced area by external factors in the sense that, everyone's connected and they're exposed to social media but, there isn't that much external food. Like there aren't many Chinese restaurants or sushi restaurants in that part of Italy. They just never adopt, like I don't I'm just curious to know if there's something more inherent like, you know, Dutch food is not healthy, right? It's a lot of cheese and fat and
Oh, that's Dutch food can be healthy.
it could be, but I mean I don't see, my sister lives in Holland, so I don't see like street food as being predominantly good for you. I'm just wondering if it factors in like if our bodies just innately gravitate towards certain cuisines and they are more resilient within us. I don't know.
I think there's a community thing.
Yeah.
There's a shared community belief, there's shared community history. There's something about the value that a community places on certain things that keeps them alive. I hear what you say about Italy because I have three children. My middle daughter went to Cortona in Tuscany for a summer abroad this past summer, and she loves pasta. But by the end of week
Good.
one, she was in tears. She was like, I need fresh vegetables. Like she was distraught
It's not red. Yeah.
after 3 weeks. But she still said to me a couple of days ago, I'd love to go live there. And I'm like, but you were, and she was like, yeah. But I think one of the
Yeah.
things that she also deeply communicated to me was that there was this sense of family, this sense of togetherness, this sense of it almost felt like it was a small space, a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone. Like there were standard and acceptable practices and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. You could pretty
Um,
much find an Irish pub anywhere in the world.
yeah, that's.
Yeah.
And even
Yeah.
there is one more comment. When we were in Florence, went to an Irish pub. As we were talking about it, your journey and your journey through food, if you could take us on a sensory journey through Nigeria, which dish would you describe? And what does it taste or smell or feels like?
It's winter here in near Toronto. And there are a couple of things I think about at this time of year in Nigeria. When I think about how winter, cold seasons always seem to have the best citrus. Like if you drink orange juice at the moment, it's amazing. And and there's a fruit in Nigeria we call agbalumo, and it's a kind of star apple. And I'll put up a picture, but sensorially, it is this orange fruit, and I will show you. I'm going to share my screen. Where are you? So it's this orange fruit that has kind of like a round top and a pointed end, and it is tart, but also sweet and sour at the same time. There's a little bit of bitterness, there's texture. This is what the fruit looks like on the inside. It has a cluster of seeds that are arranged in a star fashion, and each seed has like sweet pulp, but the flesh itself is kind of sweet, tart, sour, and bitter. And I think that speaks to a unique characteristic of Nigerian cuisine. And I know that this is a fruit, but that is sort of a reflection of what I consider balance in a lot of Nigerian meals. Balance in terms of you have these diversities of flavors and textures that work together to create kind of like a deeply satisfying result. And in my presentation, I will see if I can show you this. Okay, so for this is another expression of that balance that I speak of. And I'm speaking primarily of the image on the right, which shows skewers of beef that have been tossed and spiced with a nutty blend. So it's a peanut spice blend in this case. But you also have things like, aromatics, ginger, garlic. You have slightly bitter aspects as well. It's grilled. So you're getting kind of this complex experience while eating, but it's also balanced with fresh vegetables. So you'll have fresh raw onions, which don't somehow they lose the bite that you'd expect from onions, and you have kind of like cooling and sweet and juicy tomatoes, and sometimes you'll have chilies, you'll have cabbage, and I normally serve it with sometimes lime and cilantro. And so for me, Nigerian, whenever I eat something that's Nigerian, it's always kind of full of this elements.
Thank you for making us feel, smell. Thank you for sharing. Your words give meaning to the way we also see gastronomy, not just as food on a plate, but as a gateway to history, to communities, to people, to culture, to identity. That was absolutely brilliant, Luis, wasn't it?
It was amazing. Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much for sharing with us. This is fantastic. I just had lunch, but I'm gonna go back. I am hungry again. So, thank you. No, no, this is amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you for
Thank
having
you.
me. Thank you all for
Thank
being
you for
here.
being our guest.